Welcome to the debate. What if the timeline for the end of the world isn't, some mystery waiting to be unraveled, but a mathematically precise 14-year schedule playing out exactly like a script right now?
Or what if it's not a complex math equation at all, but a terrifyingly precise astronomical event, like a literal blood moon tripwire demanding absolute obedience to ancient laws?
Exactly. Today, we are looking at two radically different survival guides for the apocalypse. We're engaging in a rigorous academic clash between two profound theological frameworks present in our source material. On one side, we have ministry revealed, and on the other, blow the shofar.
Right, and we're digging deep into the actual metrics and timelines for identifying the end times remnant.
I represent the ministry revealed framework, arguing that the prophetic timeline is a mathematically pristine 14-year multi-dispensational typology that maps flawlessly, chapter by chapter, through the book of Acts.
And I represent the blow the shofar framework. I argue that chronological math, while intellectually stimulating, really distracts from the truth. The timeline is governed strictly by visible lunar astronomical signs, and the surviving remnant is defined entirely by return to Torah obedience and lunar Sabbath keeping.
So for those listening who have only ever been taught the standard mainstream concept of a simple 7-year tribulation, this might sound like we are speaking a foreign language.
Yeah, it's a huge paradigm shift.
It really is. So we need to define the parameters. To set the foundation from the ministry revealed perspective, we have to recognize that prophecy isn't flat. It operates on a dual calendar system.
Okay, lay that out for us.
We are looking at a 14-year chronological fractal. Think of a fractal like Russian nesting dolls of time, where a repeating pattern at the micro level perfectly explains the macro level. Prophecy runs simultaneously on a Nissan to Nissan spring calendar.
Which maps to the first half of Acts, right?
Right. We map that directly to Acts chapters 1 through 14. And then there's a Tishri to Tishri fall calendar, which maps to Acts chapters 15 through 28. But more importantly, salvation itself is divided into dispensations.
And this is where we really start to diverge.
Well, think of dispensations like rescue boats arriving at different times during a storm. The Gospel of Luke represents the first boat, the pre-tribulation bride. Mark represents the second boat, the mid-tribulation great multitude. And Matthew represents the final boat, the post-tribulation trumpets. It is a highly structured unfolding of God's grace.
Look, I approach this from a completely different foundation. While a multi-stage rescue boat analogy is comforting, I argue it fundamentally conflicts with the actual physical sky and the absolute demands of the Creator.
How so?
Well, Revelation 14:12 establishes explicitly who survives. The remnant are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. You must have both. If you look at the source material, the historical ratio of the saved is incredibly narrow. It's only about 0.2%.
Wait, hold on. 0.2%?
Yes, we see this mathematical precedent in the 12 faithful remaining out of the 5,000 or the 7,000 men preserved in Elijah's day. Furthermore, the prophetic timeline doesn't hinge on an abstract 14-year calendar overlay. It hinges on the physical heavens.
So you're pointing to these celestial bodies.
Exactly. Proverbs 7:20 tells us the husband returns at the full moon. The day of the Lord arrives specifically on a full blood moon in the month of Av. It is a visible astronomical tripwire tied intrinsically to whether or not you are keeping the everlasting covenant.
I have to stop you right there, because we cannot just gloss over that statistic. 0.2%? I mean, if we were talking about roughly 2 billion professing Christians on Earth today, you are arguing that only a few million actually survive?
The math is what it is.
That is an incredibly narrow bottleneck. And it brings us to a critical junction for cross-examination, the very definition of the remnant and the role of the law. I understand why you see Torah observance as the ultimate metric, but let's test that for internal logical consistency using the book of Acts.
Sure, let's test it.
In the ministry revealed framework, Acts chapter 15 prophetically aligns with the early stages of this 14-year timeline. We have the Jerusalem Council. The early church explicitly decided not to put the yoke of the Mosaic law on the Gentile disciples. They instructed them only to abstain from pollutions of idols, fornication, things strangled, and blood. If strict Torah obedience, specifically things like the lunar Sabbath and dietary laws, is the absolute metric for surviving the tribulation as you claim, why does the prophetic blueprint in Acts 15 explicitly exempt the Gentile remnant from that yoke?
Because you are misapplying the scope of Acts 15.
Am I?
Yes. The council wasn't saying Gentiles don't have to obey the Creator's laws. They were giving them a starting point so they could safely enter the synagogues on the Sabbath and learn the rest of the Torah over time. Let's look at the explicit warnings of the prophets.
Okay.
I respect the structural elegance of your 14-year map. I really do. But there is no grace exception for lawlessness. Consider Isaiah 66:17. It explicitly warns that those eating swine and the mouse will face sudden destruction together. That hasn't been abolished.
Right, but
Wait, or look at the words of Messiah in Matthew 7. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. In Greek, that word is anomia, literally lawlessness or being without the Torah. These are people who cast out demons in his name. They prophesy. They clearly have faith, but they refuse his law.
I see how you get there from Isaiah, but
Belief without Torah obedience is a dead faith. You can't claim to be part of his kingdom if you actively deny the lunar Sabbath, which is the seal of that kingdom.
you're merging two entirely different prophetic groups into one standard. You are taking the strict, rigid standard of the 144,000 and applying it globally to everyone.
Because there's only one standard.
No, our material shows that the 144,000, the evangelists of the Church of Philadelphia, operate under a very specific structural mandate. They represent the Orthodox core. But the great multitude, represented by the purple-clad woman of Thyatira, we see later in Acts 16, comes from a completely different dispensation.
A different dispensation doesn't mean different laws, though.
If grace doesn't operate differently at different stages, how do you logically explain these distinct groups? Why are there 144,000 Israelites and then a separate, uncountable multitude from every nation?
Because the 144,000 are the foundational structure, not a separate tier of obedience. The text points out it is 144 Aleph.
Aleph meaning the thousands, right? Well, for our listeners, Aleph is the Hebrew word for clans, families, or military units, not just a random head count of individuals. They represent the complete, structured family of Israel who strictly keep the everlasting covenant. The great multitude are simply those drawn from the nations who joined that exact same covenant.
But they aren't held to the exact same starting requirements. If you are a Gentile grafted into an olive tree, you don't get to invent a different set of rules. The root of that tree is nourished by the Torah. If you claim the law is done away with, you are telling the Creator you don't want his rules. Why would he rescue someone who refuses to live by the laws of the kingdom he is bringing?
He rescues them because the timeline of grace operates differently than the timeline of wrath. Grace isn't about ignoring the law. It's about the sequential timing of God's redemptive plan. And I think this logical challenge naturally forces us to look at the mechanics of these prophetic timelines.
Absolutely, let's look at the mechanics.
You lean entirely on this singular, physical full moon in the month of Av. But let me explain exactly how the dual calendar system works, because it answers questions a single moon cannot.
Walk me through your mechanics then.
Think of the biblical feasts, not just as holidays, but as actual chronological blueprints. The Ministry Revealed framework looks at the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and recognizes that they equate mathematically to the 7 years of the opening of the seals.
Okay, mapped on the Tishri to Nisan calendar.
Exactly. We track this on the Tishri to Nisan calendar. But here is the tripwire. The Feast of Weeks, which normally happens later in the summer, is prophetically triggered 4 months early. This early trigger acts as the pre-tribulation rapture event for the Luke's dispensation.
Right.
Then, exactly as the math dictates, Messiah ben Joseph arrives at the end of the 6th year of the seals to destroy Israel's enemies.
Let me jump in right there for a moment. Because you just mentioned Messiah ben Joseph, and I want to make sure we don't lose anyone. For listeners who might only know the imagery of the conquering king returning on a white horse, you're referring to the ancient rabbinic concept of the suffering servant, correct? The warrior who arrives first to gather the people and fight the preliminary battles?
Exactly. It's the typology of Ephraim, the ox, or the unicorn mentioned in Numbers 24. This isn't the final feat on the Mount of Olives return. This is a mid-tribulation arrival to gather the great multitude and fight the Ezekiel 39 war.
Okay, I follow the structure.
My point is, this multi-layered, highly specific chronological architecture gives every single prophecy a home. How can one single lunar eclipse in the month of Av account for a 14-year architectural structure?
Well, I'm going to give you a rapid-fire rebuttal to that, because I reject the dual calendar theory entirely. It relies on flawed Pharisaical traditions of calculating time that were adopted during the Babylonian exile. The true biblical month must start on the full moon, not the dark moon crescent.
That's a huge departure from mainstream Jewish calendar keeping.
It is, but look at Zechariah 14 and Proverbs 7. They explicitly prove the husband returns strictly on the full moon. Now, look at the actual astronomical data. August 27th to 2026 features a 93% partial blood moon.
In the month of Av.
Yes, precisely in the month of Av. And historically, Av is the exact anniversary of the destruction of both the first and second temples. That physical reality, that alignment of celestial bodies designed by the Creator in Genesis 1:14 for signs and seasons, that is your chronological tripwire, not a math equation on paper.
But if everything hinges on a single August blood moon, how do you mathematically account for the highly specific durations given in the text? I mean, Revelation 11 gives us exactly 1,260 days for the two witnesses. Revelation 13 gives us precisely 42 months for the beast's reign.
Right.
The ministry revealed framework doesn't just guess at these. It proves that those 42 months perfectly overlay the chapters of Acts.
How exactly are you mapping months to chapters of a historical book?
It's a one-to-one prophetic mapping. Think of the book of Acts as a literal map of time. Chapter 1 equals year 1. When we get to Paul being brought before the magistrates and rulers in Acts chapter 16, that directly parallels the kings of the earth siding with the beast during his 42-month reign.
I see the parallel you're drawing.
Yeah, the math fits perfectly into a 14-year grid. Every chapter is a year. Every event corresponds to the seals and trumpets. A single blood moon in 2026 simply cannot explain a 1,260-day ministry.
Yes, it can, if you map those days to the physical heavens rather than a metaphorical reading of Acts. The 42 months, and specifically the timeline of the days of Noah, apply flawlessly to the lunar calendar if you track the full moons as the start of the month.
Wait, how does Noah fit into this?
Think about the mechanics of Noah releasing the dove and the raven to check if the waters had receded. If you reverse the days of Noah chronologically, that 40-day window aligns perfectly with the month of Av, provided you are tracking time via the true lunar Sabbath.
Reversing the days?
Yes, the blood moon isn't just a symbol. It is the visible sign in the sky that initiates the bowl of wrath being poured out in the constellation of Aquarius. You cannot simply overlay chapters of a book onto years and ignore the actual sun, moon, and stars.
I am certainly not ignoring the heavens, but I am prioritizing the structural integrity of the biblical text over astrology. Let me give you another layer of the mechanics.
Go ahead.
When you look at the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles, do you not see the perfect mirror image of the 7 days of unleavened bread? In the 14-year fractal, unleavened bread equals the first 7 years of seals, tabernacles equals the final 7 years of trumpets.
So 7 and 7?
Right. 7 plus 7 gives us a 14-year framework where the micro-feasts perfectly explain the macro-tribulation.
See the symmetry you're pointing out. But the physical mechanics described in Revelation demand a specific celestial alignment that breaks your calendar. Revelation 6:12 says, the moon becomes as blood, and Isaiah 30.26 says, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the sun will be sevenfold brighter.
Okay.
Astronomically speaking, the moon can only reflect maximum light, it can only be as bright as the sun during a full moon. Therefore, the timeline must anchor to a full moon event.
Which brings us to perhaps our deepest theological divergence in this entire debate, the actual nature of the Lord's return itself. The ministry revealed material outlines what we call the three comings. It's not one fragmented, chaotic return. It is a sequenced, multi-stage rescue and reclamation mission.
Let's do a deep dive into that sequence because from the blow the shofar perspective, I see a singular, terrifying, unified day of the Lord. Walk me through the mechanics of a 3-part return.
I'd be happy to. The blueprint shows Christ first coming for the pre-tribulation bride. This corresponds to the Gospel of Luke and the above portion of the timeline, a specific 50-day window. This is the rescue of the faithful Smyrna remnant, the first boat. Then, at the end of the 6th year of seals, he comes as Messiah ben Ephraim, which we discussed earlier. This is when he gathers the great multitude, represented by Mark's Gospel, the second boat, and destroys Israel's enemies. Finally, at the absolute end of the 14 years, he returns feet down on the Mount of Olives.
The Matthew timeline.
Exactly. This corresponds to Matthew's Gospel and the sounding of the ultimate Jubilee trumpet. It is a carefully executed 3-part operation designed to harvest different groups at different times.
I have to push back hard on that. I just do not buy that fragmentation. You are taking different prophetic descriptors of the exact same event and stretching them out over 14 years to fit your math.
They aren't the same event, though.
The Blow the Shofar framework argues for a unified day of the Lord marked decisively by the rider on the white horse. Revelation 19 describes his garments dipped in blood. Astronomically, what does a garment dipped in blood look like in the heavens?
A lunar eclipse.
Right. It looks exactly like a moon that is 90% covered in the Earth's shadow, a partial blood moon, exactly like the one occurring on August 27th. The heavens are acting out the scripture.
I see the visual correlation you're making, and it's a striking image. But how does a single, unified return handle the vastly distinct demographic instructions given by Christ himself?
What do you mean?
If it's one event, why does Luke's gospel describe the disciples being told to watch and pray that they may be accounted worthy to escape all these things, while Matthew's gospel explicitly describes them fleeing to the mountains during the abomination of desolation?
Well,
You don't tell someone to pray for an escape and then simultaneously tell them to pack their bags and run for the hills. They are different instructions because they are different dispensations of time.
they aren't different timelines. They are different aspects of the same intense testing of humanity. The remnant isn't defined by when they get rescued. They're defined by their behavior under pressure.
But the texts clearly...
The day of the Lord is a visible astronomical event. When the door in heaven opens, which Scripture explicitly says happens on the Sabbath and the new moon, the judgment begins. The separation isn't pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and post-tribulation. The separation is the 0.2% who are keeping the Torah versus the 99.8% who have convinced themselves that the law is done away with.
But if we cross-examine that using Acts chapter 7, Stephen's speech perfectly encapsulates the Messiah ben Ephraim typology I'm talking about. Stephen talks about Joseph being made known to his brethren the second time. This is a profound prophetic clue.
Okay, unpack that.
Christ was known the first time during his earthly ministry. The second time he is made known is at the end of the 6th seal to the 144,000, before the final 7 years of trumpets even begin. If it's a single unified return at the very end, the typology of Joseph revealing himself to his brethren the second time while the famine is still ongoing makes absolutely no sense.
Ah, because Joseph reveals himself mid-famine.
Exactly. Joseph revealed himself while there were still years of famine left. The tribulation is still happening.
That is a very clever application of Acts 7, I'll admit. But have you considered the brutal mechanical reality of Ezekiel 5? Ezekiel is told to shave his head, weigh the hairs on scales, burn a third in the fire, strike a third with the sword, and scatter a third to the wind.
The judgment's on the people.
Right. The hairs represent the people. This judgment happens when the temple doors are open, which again points strictly to the lunar Sabbath or the renewed full moon. The physical realities of the heavens dictate the timing of this slaughter.
I agree there are physical signs, but
The sun turning black as sackcloth and the moon to blood is a literal eclipse geometry. You cannot have a 14-year abstract calendar, no matter how beautifully it maps the acts, supersede the physical signs the Creator literally placed in the sky in Genesis.
I would argue the calendar isn't abstract at all. It is intricately, undeniably woven into the historical and agricultural text of Scripture. Let's look at the Jubilee cycle for a moment. Christ declared the acceptable year of the Lord in Luke 4.
The Jubilee.
Yes. If you track the 7-year Sabbath cycles from that exact moment, aligning it with Israel coming back to the land in 1948, which mathematically had to be a Sabbath year, you hit the exact final Jubilee cycle beginning in the fall of 2025.
This isn't ignoring the heavens. It's integrating the historical, agricultural, and prophetic data into a singular 14-year map. The timeline proves that the day of the Lord is not just a 24-hour astronomical phenomenon. It is an era of transition.
But framing it as an era of transition completely removes the terrifying urgency of the sudden destruction we are warned about. The warnings are explicit, as in the days of Noah. What were they doing in the days of Noah? They were eating, drinking, marrying, activities that happen heavily in the month of Av, historically the month of love and weddings in Israel, and then, instantly, sudden destruction came.
The urgency is still there.
Is it? The remnant are those standing at the gate, actively keeping the lunar Sabbath, waiting for the bridegroom. If you tell people they have a 14-year multi-stage map with mid-tribulation grace options, you risk them becoming the foolish virgins who didn't have oil in their lamps. The oil isn't intellectual knowledge of a timeline. The oil is the Torah. The oil is obedience.
I completely disagree that providing a map removes urgency. The ministry-revealed framework explicitly warns that humanity is in a highly urgent prophetic window right now. The preparation of the Passover lambs is happening as we speak.
But you give them a second boat.
The difference is that the blueprint offers a structured typology. It tells the believer exactly what the beast will do, when the 42 months occur, and why the Moses and Elijah companies must operate during the seals to guide the great multitude. It reveals the staggering depth of God's grace by showing that even if you miss the first rescue boat, the pre-tribulation rapture, you can still call upon his name during the tribulation and be part of the great multitude, albeit at the cost of your physical life.
And from my perspective, that is exactly where the catastrophic danger lies. You are telling people they can die in the tribulation and still be part of a great multitude without returning to the everlasting covenant. I come back to Romans 2 and James 2. Faith without works is dead.
I'm not saying obedience doesn't matter.
But you cannot separate belief in Messiah from obedience to his laws. When the sky actually fractures, it will strip away all complex dispensational theology. What will be left is the stark, urgent truth. The moon turns to blood, the husband returns, and only those found keeping his commandments will enter the kingdom.
Well, we have clearly laid out two incredibly deep, thoroughly researched, and starkly contrasting perspectives today. To summarize my position, the ministry-revealed framework offers a mathematically pristine 14-year fractal blueprint. It relies on the dual calendars of Nisan and Tishri to map out the entire tribulation, year by year, through the book of Acts.
And your dispensational models?
Right. It highlights the profound depth of God's grace operating through specific dispensations, typified by Luke, Mark, and Matthew to sequence the rescue of the pre-tribulation bride, the mid-tribulation great multitude, and ultimately the restoration of natural Israel. It is a structured guide for the end-times believer.
And to summarize my position, the blow the shofar framework strips away that complex dispensationalism. It reveals the stark reality that the day of the Lord is a visible, astronomical event tied intrinsically to the lunar Sabbath and the full moon, specifically in the month of Av.
The 0.2% remnant.
Exactly. Survival does not belong to those relying on a multi-stage grace theory or a timeline on paper. It belongs only to the 0.2% remnant who repent, return to the everlasting covenant, and strictly obey the Torah. The heavens dictate the timing, and obedience dictates survival.
Yet, despite our profound differences on both the mechanism of the return and the metrics for survival, we both acknowledge a massive shared point of convergence today.
We absolutely do. The traditional mainstream church timeline of a simple, continuous, monolithic 7-year tribulation is deeply flawed, unbiblical, and leaves believers utterly unprepared.
Precisely. And we both agree that humanity is currently in a highly urgent prophetic window requiring intense spiritual vigilance. Whether you are studying the fractal patterns of the book of Acts to find exactly which rescue boat you belong in within the 14-year blueprint,
or you are watching the astronomical alignments of the lunar Sabbath, ensuring you have the oil of Torah obedience and preparing for the blood moon of Av.
The source material contains profound depths for students of end times prophecy to explore. There is immense value in testing our prophetic theology through this kind of rigorous Socratic inquiry. It sharpens the mind, exposes inconsistencies, and drives us relentlessly back to the text.
I agree entirely. Iron sharpens iron. We must continually examine the evidence, whether it's written in the margins of a page or burning brightly in the night sky.
Exactly. So we leave you with this thought. When the darkness finally falls, will you be relying on the mathematical precision of the blueprint in your hands, or will you be looking up to navigate by the blood-red light of the moon?